In medieval Europe, a queen was expected to obey her husband, but one queen refused. After years of humiliation, betrayal, and political danger, she made a decision almost no woman in the Middle Ages had ever dared to make. She raised an army. She invaded her own kingdom, and she overthrew the King of England. Her name was Isabella of France, and history would remember her as the she-wolf of France. Isabella of France was born around the year 1295. She was the only daughter of one of the most powerful rulers in Europe, Philip IV of France, and his wife Joan I of Navarre. Her father was a formidable monarch. Philip IV was known for his striking appearance, which earned him the nickname Philip the Fair. But behind that handsome face was a ruler famous for his cold calculation and political ambition. During his reign, the French monarchy became stronger than ever before. He expanded royal authority, increased taxation, and reduced the power of rebellious nobles. But Philip was also ruthless when it came to protecting his throne. In one of the most dramatic political moves of the Middle Ages, he ordered the destruction of the powerful Knights Templar, accusing them of heresy and seizing their immense wealth. Isabella grew up in this world of power, intrigue, and royal authority. Her mother, Joan of Navarre, was equally impressive in a different way. Unlike many medieval queens, Joan ruled lands in her own right. She was Queen of Navarre and Countess of Champagne, territories she inherited through her own family. She was respected for her intelligence and strong character, and when the king was away, she often governed as regent. At the French court, Joan was known as a dignified and capable ruler who understood politics as well as any nobleman. Growing up, Isabella watched her parents closely. From her father, she learned political strategy and ambition. From her mother, she learned how a queen could wield influence and authority. These lessons would later shape the decisions that would shock all of Europe. The French royal court, where Isabella grew up, was one of the most magnificent in medieval Europe. It was filled with diplomats, scholars, knights, and artists. Court ceremonies were elaborate, clothing was extravagant, and etiquette was strictly observed. Isabella received the education expected of a royal princess. She learned languages, religion, diplomacy, and courtly behavior. But she also grew up surrounded by politics and power struggles. And by the time she reached her early teenage years, her path had already been chosen. Like many royal daughters of the time, she was expected to serve the interests of the crown through marriage. The kingdom selected for that alliance was England. In 1308, when Isabella of France was just 12 years old, she was sent across the English Channel to marry Edward II of England. For medieval monarchs, marriage was rarely about love. It was diplomacy. Alliances between kingdoms were often sealed through royal weddings, and Isabella's marriage was meant to strengthen the fragile peace between France and England. But the young princess quickly discovered that her new husband was not the king she might have expected. Edward II had grown up in the shadow of his powerful father, Edward I of England. Edward I had been one of the most feared rulers in Europe. He conquered Wales, fought brutal wars against Scotland, and ruled England with iron determination. His long military campaigns and harsh discipline earned him the nickname the Hammer of the Scots. He was everything a medieval king was expected to be: a warrior, a conqueror, and a strict ruler. His son was very different. Edward II had little interest in war or military glory. Instead, he preferred music, poetry, and the pleasures of courtly life. But the greatest controversy surrounding the young king was his relationship with one particular nobleman. His name was Piers Gaveston. Gaveston had originally been assigned as a companion to the young prince by Edward I. The king hoped the experienced knight would teach his son the skills of chivalry and warfare. Instead, the two men formed an extremely close bond. Many chroniclers believed their relationship was romantic, although historians still debate the exact nature of it. What is certain is that Edward trusted Gaveston completely, and that trust gave Gaveston enormous influence at court. When Isabella arrived in England, she walked directly into this complicated and dangerous situation. The signs of trouble appeared almost immediately. At the wedding feast, Edward reportedly ignored his young bride and spent most of the evening beside Gaveston. Even worse, several magnificent wedding gifts that had been intended for the Queen were given to Gaveston instead. Isabella's French relatives were outraged by the insult. For a princess raised at the powerful French court, the humiliation was shocking. And it would only get worse. Only a few weeks after the wedding, Isabella of France and Edward II of England were crowned at Westminster Abbey. For a medieval queen, a coronation was more than a ceremony. It was a public declaration of status, honor, and legitimacy. Every noble in the kingdom watched closely to see how the new queen would be treated. What they saw shocked them. During the celebration, Piers Gaveston appeared dressed in magnificent clothing that rivaled even the king's own attire. According to several chroniclers, he wore jewels that had originally been given to Queen Isabella as part of her wedding gifts. The insult was impossible to ignore. Even more shocking, Edward granted Gaveston one of the highest ceremonial honors, carrying the royal crown during the procession. In a court where rank and symbolism meant everything, this gesture was deeply controversial. Many nobles believed the king was elevating his favorite above the queen herself. For the young Isabella, the humiliation must have been profound. She had been raised at the powerful French court of her father, Philip IV of France, where royal dignity was taken very seriously. A queen of France's bloodline was not meant to be overshadowed by a court favorite. Yet that was exactly what was happening in England. Still only a teenager, Isabella found herself trapped in a dangerous position. She had little political power, no allies in the English court, and a husband who seemed more devoted to another man than to his own queen. But Isabella was not foolish. Instead of openly confronting the situation, she chose a different strategy. She adapted. Rather than attacking Gaveston directly, the young queen attempted to build a friendly relationship with him. She showed courtesy and charm, hoping to soften the tension and perhaps win the king's attention in the process. It was a careful balancing act, one that required patience, intelligence, and emotional control. For a time, it seemed to work. But outside the royal household, resentment toward Gaveston was growing rapidly. The English barons watched with increasing anger as the king showered his favorite with titles, wealth, and privileges. They believed Gaveston was manipulating the king and abusing royal power for his own gain. In a feudal kingdom, the king relied heavily on the loyalty of his powerful nobles, and that loyalty was beginning to crumble. Soon, the conflict between the king and his barons would explode into open rebellion. And when that happened, Queen Isabella would find herself caught between two dangerous forces: a weak and stubborn king, and an angry nobility determined to remove the man they blamed for England's troubles. The struggle for power had only just begun. Resentment toward Piers Gaveston continued to grow among the powerful nobles of England. To them, Gaveston was not simply the king's companion. He was a dangerous outsider who had gained enormous influence over the crown. King Edward II of England granted him lands, titles, and privileges that many nobles believed he did not deserve. Worse still, Gaveston was often arrogant toward the barons, openly mocking some of the most powerful men in the kingdom. In a feudal society built on honor and hierarchy, such insults could not be ignored. Eventually, a coalition of angry barons forced the king to accept a humiliating compromise. Gaveston would be exiled from England. But Edward had no intention of losing his closest companion. Within months, the king secretly allowed Gaveston to return. This decision enraged the nobles even further and pushed the kingdom closer to open conflict. Meanwhile, Queen Isabella of France remained in a delicate position. She could not openly challenge her husband, but she also understood that the growing crisis threatened the stability of the entire kingdom. Around this time, Isabella finally secured an important advantage. In 1312, she gave birth to a son, the future Edward III of England. The birth of a male heir transformed Isabella's position at court. No longer just a neglected young queen, she was now the mother of the future King of England. Her influence immediately increased, but events were already spiraling toward violence. That same year, a group of powerful barons captured Gaveston. The king tried desperately to protect him, but his authority was too weak. In a hastily arranged trial, the nobles accused Gaveston of treason. The verdict was swift. He was executed. When news of Gaveston's death reached the king, he was devastated. Edward never forgave the nobles who had ordered the execution. From that moment on, the relationship between the king and the barons was poisoned by bitterness and revenge. England had entered a dangerous period of political instability, and the young queen would soon find herself caught in the middle of an increasingly chaotic kingdom. But the greatest crisis for Edward II was still to come, and this is only the beginning. If you enjoy thoughtful history, stay with this channel and subscribe. After the death of Piers Gaveston, many in England hoped the kingdom might finally return to stability. But the problems surrounding Edward II of England were far deeper than the influence of a single court favorite. The king had already lost the trust of many powerful nobles, and beyond England's borders another threat was growing. In the north, Scotland was rising in rebellion. For years, England had tried to dominate its northern neighbor. Edward II's father, Edward I of England, had spent much of his reign fighting Scottish resistance. But after his death, the struggle continued under the leadership of one remarkable man, Robert the Bruce. By 1314, Bruce had rebuilt the strength of the Scottish army and challenged English authority across the region. Edward II decided to confront the rebellion directly. He assembled a massive army and marched north. The confrontation that followed would become one of the most famous battles in British history. In June 1314, the English and Scottish forces met at the Battle of Bannockburn. The English army was far larger and better equipped, but leadership, strategy, and discipline would determine the outcome. And in those areas, the Scottish king proved far superior. Robert the Bruce used the terrain to his advantage, trapping the English army in narrow ground where their numbers worked against them. The result was a devastating defeat. The English army collapsed in chaos, and the king himself barely escaped the battlefield. The humiliation of Bannockburn shattered Edward II's reputation. For a medieval king, military success was essential to maintaining authority. Without it, his position became dangerously fragile. Across England, criticism of the king intensified. Nobles questioned his leadership. Ordinary people blamed him for the kingdom's misfortunes. And as if military defeat were not enough, an even greater disaster soon followed. Between 1315 and 1317, Europe was struck by a catastrophic crisis known as the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. Heavy rains destroyed harvests. Food shortages spread across the continent. Prices soared, and hunger became widespread. In England, many people believed the kingdom was suffering because God was punishing the immoral behavior of its ruler. The reputation of Edward II continued to decline. The disaster of the Battle of Bannockburn, followed by the suffering of the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, left the Kingdom of England deeply unstable. The authority of the king was weakening, and discontent among the nobility was growing. It was in this tense and uncertain atmosphere that another powerful figure began to rise at court. His name was Hugh Despenser the Younger. Like Gaveston before him, Despenser quickly became one of the king's closest companions. But unlike Gaveston, he was far more politically ambitious. He was determined to turn the king's favor into enormous personal power. And for Queen Isabella, he would soon become the most dangerous enemy she had ever faced. Many nobles blamed Edward II of England for the country's misfortunes. Yet instead of rebuilding trust with his barons, the king once again placed his confidence in a powerful favorite. This time, the man who rose to influence was Hugh Despenser the Younger. At first, Despenser seemed very different from the king's former companion, Piers Gaveston. He was not known for flamboyant displays or reckless behavior. Instead, he was patient, ambitious, and politically calculating. Together with his father, Hugh Despenser the Elder, he began quietly expanding his influence at court. But it did not take long before that influence turned into something far more dangerous. Using the king's support, the Despensers began claiming lands across England and Wales. Rival nobles suddenly found their estates seized or transferred into Despenser hands. Some families lost generations of wealth almost overnight. To many barons, it felt as if the kingdom itself was being slowly taken over. Anger toward the Despensers spread rapidly through the English nobility. But for Isabella of France, the situation was becoming personal. Unlike Gaveston, Hugh Despenser saw the queen not as a harmless presence, but as a potential threat. A queen who held influence over the king could weaken his own position. And so Despenser began carefully working to separate the king from his wife. Little by little, Isabella's authority at court began to shrink. Her lands were restricted. Members of her household were dismissed. Some of her closest supporters were even imprisoned. For a medieval queen, losing control over her household was more than an insult. It was a warning. It meant that the protection normally surrounding a queen was beginning to disappear, and Isabella was starting to understand that the danger around her was growing. Yet publicly, she continued to perform her duties as queen. During these difficult years, she gave birth to 3 more children: John of Eltham, Eleanor of Woodstock, and Joan of the Tower. To the outside world, the royal family still appeared stable, but inside the court, tensions were quietly building, and soon events would push the queen to her breaking point. By the early 1320s, the influence of Hugh Despenser the Younger had reached its peak. With the support of Edward II of England, the Despenser family controlled enormous wealth and political power across England and Wales. Many nobles had been stripped of their lands, and resentment against the king was growing more intense every year. But the conflict was no longer limited to angry barons. Now, even the queen herself was beginning to feel the consequences of Despenser's ambition. In 1322, Edward launched yet another military campaign toward the north, once again hoping to assert English authority against the Scots under Robert the Bruce. As had often happened before, Isabella of France accompanied the royal court during the campaign. But what followed would become one of the most humiliating moments of her life. During the retreat from Scotland, the royal party stopped at Tynemouth Priory on the northeast coast. The Scottish army was advancing quickly, and the situation was becoming dangerous. Instead of ensuring the Queen's safety, Edward and Hugh Despencer made a shocking decision. They fled, leaving Isabella behind. The Queen suddenly found herself trapped as Scottish forces approached the priory. Her household knights fought desperately to protect her while she prepared to escape by sea. The fighting was fierce. Several of the Queen's loyal men were killed defending her. Two of her ladies-in-waiting also died during the chaos of the attack. At last, Isabella managed to board a ship and escape. But the experience left a deep scar. For a medieval queen, protection from her husband was not simply expected, it was fundamental. To be abandoned in the face of danger was more than an insult. It was a betrayal. From that moment on, Isabella's relationship with the king would never fully recover. Furious and humiliated, the queen withdrew from court for many months. She traveled across England on what was officially described as a religious pilgrimage. But many historians believe the journey served another purpose. It gave Isabella time to reflect on everything that had happened. For years, she had endured humiliation, isolation, and political marginalization. Now she had nearly lost her life, and the man responsible for protecting her had simply ridden away. Yet the worst was still to come. While Isabella was away, the influence of the Despensers grew even stronger, and when the Queen returned, she would discover that her position at court had become even more precarious than before. The next move by the king and his favorite would push Isabella to the edge and eventually lead her toward open rebellion. After the terrifying escape from Tynemouth Priory, the relationship between Isabella of France and her husband, Edward II of England, was deeply damaged. Although the Queen eventually returned to court, the atmosphere around her had changed. The influence of Hugh Despencer the Younger had only grown stronger during her absence, and Despencer had no intention of allowing the Queen to regain any power. At the same time, tensions between England and France were rising. For decades, English kings had controlled the region of Gascony in southern France, but Isabella's brother, Charles IV of France, began challenging English authority there. The conflict threatened to turn into open war. Edward II needed diplomacy. But instead of strengthening his relationship with his French-born queen, the king allowed the Despensers to tighten their control over her. Soon, Isabella faced a humiliating demand. The king insisted that she swear an oath of loyalty to Hugh Despencer. For a queen of royal blood, the daughter of Philip IV of France, this was an extraordinary insult. She refused. The response was swift and ruthless. Edward and the Despensers stripped Isabella of much of her income and confiscated lands that traditionally belonged to the Queen. Her household was reduced. Several of her servants were arrested. Even worse, the royal couple's children were removed from her care and placed under the supervision of the Despencer family. For a mother and a queen, this was a devastating blow. For nearly 2 decades, Isabella had endured humiliation, political isolation, and personal betrayal. She had tried to remain loyal. She had tried to preserve peace between the king and his nobles, but now even her children had been taken from her. The message was clear. At the English court, the Queen herself no longer held real power. Yet Isabella was far more intelligent than her enemies realized. Instead of openly confronting the king, she chose patience. Outwardly, she appeared calm and obedient. Privately, she began to plan. Soon, an opportunity would appear, one that would allow the Queen to leave England. And once she did, everything would change. Tensions between England and France were continuing to escalate over the disputed territory of Gascony. Isabella's brother, Charles IV of France, was threatening to seize the region unless the English king personally came to France to pay homage. Edward refused. Traveling to France could place him in a vulnerable position, and the political situation in England was already unstable. So a compromise was proposed. The Queen herself would travel to France as a diplomatic envoy to negotiate peace. For Edward and his favorite, Hugh Despenser the Younger, the decision seemed harmless. After years of political defeat, Isabella appeared broken and obedient. They believed she would faithfully serve their interests abroad. In 1325, the Queen crossed the Channel and arrived at the French court. But once she reached France, something unexpected happened. Isabella refused to return. Instead, she wrote to her husband declaring that she would not come back to England until Hugh Despenser was removed from power. It was a shocking act of defiance. For the first time, the Queen was openly challenging the king. Soon after arriving in France, Isabella requested that her eldest son travel to Paris. The young prince, Edward III of England, was only 13 years old. Officially, he was sent to France to perform the ceremonial act of paying homage to his uncle, King Charles IV, on behalf of his father. Edward II agreed. He had no reason to suspect what was about to happen. But once the prince arrived in France, Isabella refused to send him back. Now the Queen had something incredibly powerful, the heir to the English throne. With her son at her side, Isabella's position suddenly changed. She was no longer an isolated queen. She was the protector of the future King of England. And in France, she soon met a man who shared her hatred for the Despensers. His name was Roger Mortimer. Mortimer had once been one of the most powerful lords in England, but after clashing with the Despensers, he had been imprisoned in the Tower of London. In 1323, he escaped and fled to France. Now, fate had brought him face to face with the Queen. The meeting between Isabella of France and Roger Mortimer in France would soon change the course of English history. Both had suffered under the growing power of Hugh Despenser the Younger and his father. Both had watched as Edward II of England placed loyalty to his favorites above the stability of his kingdom. Now, far from the reach of the English court, they had something they had never possessed before: freedom to act. At first, their alliance was political. Mortimer understood the anger that many English nobles felt toward the Despensers. Isabella, meanwhile, held something even more powerful: the loyalty of those who still respected the royal bloodline. And beside her stood her 13-year-old son, Edward III of England, the rightful heir to the throne. Together, they represented an alternative future for England. But organizing a rebellion required more than determination. It required money, soldiers, and allies. Fortunately for Isabella, her royal connections across Europe provided opportunities. One of the most important alliances came from the Low Countries, where the powerful noble William I, Count of Hainaut, ruled over a wealthy and strategically important region. Isabella negotiated a marriage between her son Edward and William's daughter, Philippa of Hainaut. In return, the Count agreed to support her cause. The marriage alliance brought with it something crucial: ships, soldiers, and funding for an invasion. Meanwhile, back in England, Edward II of England and the Despensers began to realize that the Queen's absence was becoming a serious threat. The king ordered Isabella to return immediately. She refused. Instead, she sent word that she would not come back to England until the Despensers were removed from power. Her defiance shocked the royal court. For the first time, the Queen had openly challenged the king's authority. Yet Edward still underestimated the danger. He believed that Isabella lacked the military strength to act against him. But across the Channel, preparations were already underway. Ships were being gathered, mercenaries recruited, and support for the Queen's cause was quietly spreading among English nobles who had suffered under Despenser rule. Slowly but surely, Isabella was building an army. By the summer of 1326, everything was ready. The Queen, the rebel Lord Mortimer, and the young Prince Edward prepared to cross the sea. What began as a desperate escape from England was about to become something far greater: an invasion led by a queen. In September 1326, their fleet of ships finally crossed the English Channel. The landing took place on the eastern coast of England, near Suffolk. Although their army was relatively small, the rebels possessed something even more powerful: support. As news of the Queen's arrival spread across the country, discontented nobles and knights began to join her cause. For years, many of them had suffered under the growing power of the Despensers. Now they saw their chance for revenge. Within days, the rebellion began to grow rapidly. Local lords opened their gates. Towns declared loyalty to the Queen and the young prince. Even members of the clergy began to support the movement. The invasion that Edward II had dismissed as impossible was suddenly turning into a national uprising. Back in London, the king was shocked by how quickly the situation was collapsing. The authority of Edward II of England had already been weakened by years of military defeat and political favoritism. Now, even some of his closest allies were abandoning him. Panic spread through the royal court. As Isabella's forces advanced toward the capital, Edward and Hugh Despenser the Younger made a desperate decision. They fled. Taking what treasure they could carry, the king and his favorite escaped westward, hoping to gather loyal supporters in Wales. But the tide had already turned. Meanwhile, in London, the Queen's supporters seized control of the city. The powerful Bishop Walter de Stapledon, a loyal supporter of the king, was captured and killed by an angry crowd. The capital had fallen into rebel hands, and across England, people were beginning to believe that the rule of Edward II was coming to an end. But Isabella's mission was not yet complete. The king was still free, and as long as he remained at large, the war was not over. So the Queen and Mortimer continued their pursuit. They intended to capture the king and bring his rule to a final end. The rebels had control of most of the kingdom. Eventually, the fugitives were discovered hiding in the rugged countryside of Wales. Edward was exhausted, frightened, and abandoned by many of those who had once served him. The royal party was captured and taken into custody. For Isabella and her allies, the moment they had waited for had finally arrived. The fate of Hugh Despenser the Younger was decided first. For years he had been accused of corruption, greed, and cruelty toward England's nobles. Now those same nobles demanded justice. In November 1326, Despenser was brought before Isabella and Mortimer to face judgment. He was condemned as a traitor to the realm. The execution that followed was brutal even by the harsh standards of the Middle Ages. Despenser was dragged through the streets, hanged, and then subjected to the traditional punishment for traitors, a gruesome public death meant to serve as a warning to others. His father, Hugh Despenser the Elder, had already been executed days earlier. Within a short time, the powerful family that had dominated England was completely destroyed. But one question still remained. What would happen to the king himself? Removing a royal favorite was one thing. Deposing a crowned king was something far more dangerous. For centuries, English monarchs had ruled by what many believed was divine authority. Yet the kingdom now faced a reality no one could ignore. Edward II had lost the trust of his nobles, his people, and even his own queen. And soon, a decision would be made that would change English history forever. After the fall of the Despensers, the fate of Edward II of England could no longer be avoided. The captured king was taken into custody while the leaders of the realm began to debate what should be done. Removing corrupt advisors had been widely supported, but the question of a reigning monarch was far more delicate. No English king had willingly given up the throne before, yet the political reality was impossible to ignore. Many nobles believed that Edward's years of favoritism, military failures, and political instability had pushed the kingdom into crisis. In early 1327, a parliament was assembled in London to decide the future of the crown. Representatives of the clergy, nobles, and towns gathered to hear the charges against the king. Among the accusations were his neglect of government, his reliance on unpopular favorites, and the chaos that had spread across the country during his reign. One by one, arguments were made that Edward had failed in his duty as king. Eventually, a decision was reached. Rather than executing the monarch, something that could provoke outrage across Europe, the assembly declared that Edward should step down from the throne. The crown would pass instead to his son, the 14-year-old Edward III of England. Faced with overwhelming pressure and with little support left, the imprisoned king agreed to abdicate. After nearly 20 years on the throne, his reign had come to an end. Soon afterward, the young Edward III was formally proclaimed king. Because of his age, however, the real authority of the kingdom remained in the hands of those who had led the rebellion. Most importantly, Isabella of France and her closest political ally, Roger Mortimer. Together, they now governed England in the name of the new king. For Isabella, the transformation was extraordinary. Only a short time earlier, she had been a powerless queen isolated at court. Now she stood at the center of power. But ruling a kingdom would prove to be far more complicated than seizing it. And the presence of a living former king still cast a long shadow over the new regime. With the crown now placed on the head of Edward III of England, the political crisis seemed, at least on the surface, resolved. England had a new king, and the rebellion that had swept the country only months earlier had succeeded. But one problem still remained. The former monarch was still alive. Edward II of England, now stripped of his crown, had been placed under guard and moved between several castles for security. Eventually, he was taken to Berkeley Castle, where he was held under close watch. For the new government led by Isabella of France and Roger Mortimer, his existence created a constant danger. As long as Edward lived, he remained a potential symbol for rebellion. Supporters who still believed he was the rightful king could attempt to restore him to the throne. And in fact, several such plots quickly appeared. Across the country, rumors spread that loyalists were planning to free the former king from captivity. At least a few conspiracies were uncovered, and there were even reports that Edward himself attempted to escape his guards. Whether these threats were real or exaggerated, they deeply worried the new regime. The political situation in England was still fragile, and Isabella and Mortimer could not risk another civil conflict. Then, in September 1327, news spread suddenly across the kingdom. The former king was dead. The official announcement declared that Edward II of England had died while imprisoned at Berkeley Castle. He was only 43 years old. The government quickly organized a royal funeral, and the body was buried with full ceremony at Gloucester Cathedral. To the public, the message was clear. The troubled reign of Edward II had finally come to an end. But almost immediately, darker rumors began to circulate. Some claimed that the former king had not died naturally at all. According to a story that would become famous centuries later, Edward had been murdered in prison in a particularly brutal way, killed secretly so that no visible marks would be left on his body. The tale spread widely and eventually appeared in later literature, including the play Edward II. However, many modern historians believe that this gruesome story was likely a later invention, shaped by political propaganda and medieval hostility toward the king's relationships with his male favorites. The exact circumstances of Edward's death remain uncertain even today. What is certain is that after his death, the political landscape changed once again. With the death of Edward II of England, the last major threat to the new government seemed to disappear. England now had a young king, Edward III of England, but the true authority of the kingdom rested in the hands of his mother, Isabella of France, and her closest ally, Roger Mortimer. Together they ruled the country as regents, making decisions in the king's name while he was still too young to govern on his own. At first, many in England welcomed the change. The downfall of the Despensers had been widely celebrated, and people hoped that the new leadership would bring stability after years of conflict. But over time, the optimism began to fade. Mortimer's influence over the government grew steadily stronger, and many nobles began to notice that the new regime was beginning to resemble the one it had replaced. Large estates and wealth were granted to Mortimer and his allies. Titles and lands confiscated during the rebellion were redistributed among those loyal to the new rulers. Some members of the nobility began to whisper that Mortimer was becoming too powerful. In 1328, Mortimer's authority reached a new height when he was granted the title Roger Mortimer, one of the most powerful noble positions in the realm. To many observers, it seemed clear that he was now the most influential man in England. Although the kingdom technically belonged to the young king, real decisions were often made by Mortimer and supported by Isabella. For a while, this arrangement held. But resentment was quietly building among England's powerful families. Another controversial decision further weakened their support. The government negotiated peace with Robert the Bruce, ending the long and costly war between England and Scotland. The agreement recognized Scotland's independence and arranged the marriage of Isabella's daughter, Joan of the Tower, to the Scottish king's young son, David II of Scotland. While the treaty brought an end to years of fighting, many English nobles were outraged. For generations, English kings had tried to dominate Scotland. To them, the peace felt like a humiliating surrender. Meanwhile, the young king himself was growing older. Edward III of England was no longer a child. As he entered his late teenage years, he began to understand the true balance of power in his own kingdom. Officially, he was the ruler of England. But in practice, decisions were still made by his mother and Mortimer. And the longer this continued, the more it began to trouble him. By the autumn of 1330, tension at court had reached a breaking point. The young king, Edward III of England, was now 17 years old. No longer a child, he had begun to resent the fact that real power in England remained firmly in the hands of his mother, Isabella of France, and her powerful ally, Roger Mortimer. For years he had watched as Mortimer controlled the royal council, distributed lands and titles, and made decisions in the king's name. Many nobles who once supported Isabella's rebellion now feared that Mortimer had become even more powerful than the men he had helped destroy. Edward understood that as long as Mortimer remained in control, he would never truly rule his own kingdom. So he began to plan carefully and in secret. Among the few men he trusted was the loyal knight William Montague, who helped organize a small group of supporters willing to risk everything to restore the king's authority. Their opportunity came in October 1330, when the royal court gathered at Nottingham Castle. The fortress was considered secure, and Mortimer believed himself safe inside its walls. Guards loyal to him controlled the main entrances, and few imagined that anyone would dare challenge his power directly. But Montague knew of a secret passage that led into the castle. Late one night, Edward and a small band of about 24 loyal men quietly entered through this hidden tunnel. Moving through the dark corridors, they made their way toward the chambers where Mortimer was staying. The sudden confrontation that followed shocked the entire court. Mortimer was seized before he had time to organize any resistance. Isabella, awakened by the commotion, reportedly cried out to her son in desperation, "Fair son, have pity on gentle Mortimer." But the young king had already made his decision. After years of watching others rule in his name, Edward III of England was finally taking control of his kingdom. Mortimer was arrested and taken into custody, bringing an abrupt end to the powerful partnership that had governed England since the fall of Edward II of England. Within weeks, Mortimer was put on trial before Parliament. He was charged with a long list of crimes: abusing royal authority, enriching himself at the expense of the crown, and playing a role in the death of the former king. The verdict was swift. Roger Mortimer was condemned for treason and executed at Tyburn in November 1330. And from that moment forward, Edward III of England would go on to become one of the most powerful and successful monarchs in English history. After the fall of Roger Mortimer, the life of Isabella of France grew strangely quiet. For years, she had lived at the center of intrigue, danger, and power. She had crossed the sea with an army, overthrown a king, and ruled one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe. But after Edward III of England seized control of the government in 1330, that turbulent chapter ended almost overnight. Mortimer was gone. Power slipped from Isabella's hands, and for the first time in decades, the woman once feared across England was simply a mother and a widow of history. Edward III chose not to punish her harshly. Despite everything that had happened, the rebellion, the fall of his father Edward II of England, and the years of political manipulation, Isabella was still the woman who had given him life. Instead of prison or disgrace, the king allowed her to withdraw from politics and live comfortably on royal estates. She eventually made her home at Castle Rising, a peaceful residence far from the storms of court life. The fortress overlooked quiet fields and distant marshes. There were no rival nobles plotting in the halls, no armies marching across the countryside, no desperate letters from allies and enemies. Only time. In those quieter years, Isabella's life softened. She still traveled to visit the royal court from time to time, and the relationship between mother and son slowly healed. Edward III of England had grown into a confident and powerful ruler, and while he had taken the throne from the shadow of her influence, he never entirely cast her aside. Isabella remained an honored queen mother. She spent time with her children and grandchildren, watching a new generation of royalty grow up around her, a peaceful contrast to the brutal politics that had shaped her youth. Her children carried her legacy across Europe. Edward III would rule England for half a century and become one of the most formidable monarchs of the Middle Ages. His reign would eventually lead to the long conflict between England and France known as the Hundred Years' War. Her daughter Joan of the Tower became Queen of Scotland after marrying David II of Scotland. From the quiet halls of Castle Rising, Isabella could watch the political map of Europe shift around the lives of her children, a reminder that her own actions had helped shape that future. Yet it is impossible to know what Isabella truly felt in those final decades. She had been a young girl sent to a foreign country to marry a king who barely noticed her. She had endured humiliation, political isolation, and the terrifying instability of medieval power. She had raised an army, brought down a monarchy, and ruled a kingdom beside a man she loved, only to see that world collapse again. Few queens in history had lived through so much. In 1358, Isabella died at the age of 63. She was buried in Greyfriars Church, ending a life that had stretched from the powerful royal court of France to the violent politics of England. According to tradition, she was buried wearing the same headdress she had worn on the day she married Edward II of England, many decades earlier. And inside her coffin was placed a small casket containing his preserved heart. A strange, almost poetic symbol of a marriage that had begun with hope and ended in one of the most dramatic struggles for power in medieval history. Centuries later, Isabella would be remembered by many names. Some called her ambitious, others called her ruthless. But history gave her the most famous title of all, the She-Wolf of France. Yet behind that legend was also a woman who had fought to survive in a world where queens rarely held power, and who, for a brief moment, changed the course of a kingdom. Thank you for watching. If you value history told carefully and accurately, consider staying with this channel and subscribing. The past deserves precision as much as curiosity.